Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. The world awaits Iran's response after the US hits nuclear sites in the Islamic Republic. President Trump warns of repercussions for any retaliation.
Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
Oil gains on concerns about supply disruption, with the focus on whether Iran will move to block the crucial Strait of Hormuz. US and European futures slide while the dollar gains amid concerns around escalation of the conflict. Good morning. So US military action opening the Pandora's box in the Middle East. The questions, of course, for the markets is what happens next in terms of that potential Iranian retaliation. European futures down by 0.5%, risk off across the equity markets, and you are seeing a similar picture over in Asia as well. Here in the UK, the FTSE 100 pointing low by 31 points. Watch the energy majors, of course, on higher oil prices. Defence stocks getting a bid over in Asia. Tech stocks getting a bit of a hit. S&P futures currently pointing low by 0.3%. Nasdaq 100 futures stateside looking to lose around 78 points, 0.4%. Let's flip the board and have a look cross asset. And then the focus, of course, is on the oil price volatility, which continues. You saw a big spike at the start of the trading session, up around 6%. That has paired to some extent. Brent now trading at $78 a barrel, up 1.4%, well below the highs earlier of the session. But again, the focus on what Iran does and whether or not the Strait of Hormuz is an area they look to disrupt. Gold actually a little weaker in the session, down 0.2% on that traditional haven, of course, at 3,360 per troy ounce. The dollar is bid up 0.3%. You're seeing a bit of pressure on the other currencies in that basket, but the dollar is getting a lift, and the Asian session as well under pressure on the geopolitical risk, down 1.1% so far on the MSCI Asia Pacific. So the US strikes on Iran have, of course, sharply raised those geopolitical risks in a global economy already, of course, facing uncertainty over President Trump's trade war. The world is now watching for the response from Tehran after the US deployed bunker-busting bombs to strike the regime's nuclear sites, claiming it has now significantly set back those uranium enrichment capabilities. But independent analysis has yet to confirm Trump's claims. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the attacks have nothing to do with regime change.
This mission was a very precise mission. It had three objectives, three nuclear sites. It was not an attack on Iran. It was not an attack on the Iranian people. This wasn't a regime change move. This was designed to degrade and or destroy three nuclear sites related to their nuclear weaponization ambitions, and that was delivered on yesterday. What happens next will now depend on what Iran chooses to do next.
Meanwhile, Iran says the US has decided not to take the diplomatic path.
The world must not forget that it was the United States which, in the midst of a process to forge a diplomatic outcome, betrayed diplomacy.
For more on this, we are joined by Horizon's anchor, Jumana Basecci, of course, joining us out of the Middle East. Jumana, the focus on potential Iranian retaliation. What is Iran, or what Iran could be looking at in terms of retaliating and responding to these unprecedented US attacks?
Well, we got those comments from the foreign minister that you were just playing a little bit of sound from, and he was saying that Iran reserves the right to protect its people and its sovereignty, that the window and the door to diplomacy is now closed. But also worth pointing out as well that the U.S. framed these attacks on the nuclear sites as targeted attacks and not an attack on Iranian people. They didn't target civilians and really framed it as a one-off strike. Now, the question from here onwards is whether Iran chooses to respond in a targeted manner as well. And there's one recent history, an example from recent history that we can draw from. Back in 2020, after the U.S. took out Qasem Soleimani, one of the senior military figures within the Iranian regime, 5 days later, Iran responded by striking at a U.S. asset, a U.S. military base in Iraq. But what they did then is they telegraphed to the U.S. beforehand that they were going to do it. There were no fatalities authorities recorded at the time, but it was their way of saying that they had done something and they saved face without causing a significant amount of disruption. So they could go for that sort of targeted response. Now, other measures that have been talked about, they could target U.S. military sites within the GCC. That would deem to be an extreme escalation, not least because they'd be hitting assets within these Gulf countries that have spent a lot of time over the last couple of years trying to mediate and fix the relationship with Iran. So they would be also wading into uncharted territory with those Gulf states that are also their neighbors. Another option would be to disrupt shipping on Strait of Hormuz. That is something that energy analysts have been watching out for. Should they go down that route, again, it could be self-disruptive because so many of their oil exports rely on passing through that route, and they would be cutting off a key lifeline for their own economy. And then the final route is non-military, Tom, and they also spoke about this. The Iranian foreign minister also said that one possible path is to leave that non-proliferation treaty, i.e. to send a message to the rest of the world that even though Iran is being attacked, it's only hardened their resolve to build a nuclear weapon.
Jumana, what is our understanding right now of the damage inflicted on those nuclear sites by U.S. bombing?
Well, the U.S. have called those attacks incredibly successful. U.S. President Trump has said that they've managed to obliterate many of those nuclear sites. Now, what we do have is satellite imagery. We have an initial assessment from IAEA, and they're saying that in Isfahan, which, of course, is one of the nuclear sites that has already been hit by Israel, there has been extensive additional damage at that particular site. Fordo, not immediately possible to assess in view of its underground location and the penetrating nature of the bombs used. It's really difficult for them to ascertain at this point how much damage has been sustained, given that so much of that stockpile is stored underground. And then the final site, Natanz, which has been previously extensively damaged, was again attacked during the site. So we know for sure that damage has been leveled. But whether this is the fatal blow that the U.S. are looking for, and indeed Israel have been looking for, is up for debate, because what the Iranians say is they managed to move some of these highly enriched uranium stockpiles away from sites, the secretive locations, before these strikes even took place. And so you could argue that the Iranians still have the equipment, they still have some of the stockpiles, and they have the technical know-how should they want to restart the nuclear program again in the future. And I think that is going to be a big question as we look into the days and months ahead in terms of how long this war could possibly go on for.
Yeah, to your point, 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium still somewhere in Iran. The location is yet unknown, at least to the US and Israel, it seems. Bloomberg Horizon's Middle East anchor Jumana Pasechi, thank you. To the oil market reaction now, oil jumping after the US attacks on Iran, stoking concerns that energy supplies from the Middle East, as Jumana was saying, could be disrupted. Brent crude surged as much as 5.7% before pairing much of that gain in heavy trading. As the world braces for Tehran's response, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has called on China to pressure Iran not to close the Strait of Hormuz. About a fifth of the world's crude output passes through the Strait.
People that should be angry about it are the Chinese government, because they take a lot of their oil comes through there. So they should be the first ones that are saying if they mine the Straits of Hormuz, the Chinese are going to pay a huge price.
For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Stephen Stupczynski. Stephen, how much risk premium then has been factored in at levels we see today, given that the upside pressure on oil prices is now relatively muted in the context of this significant geopolitical event?
You know, oil prices are still up 10% since Israel launched the strikes on Iranian nuclear sites about 2 weeks ago. So or a week and a half ago. So we are still in a risk premium situation. Prices are higher than where the fundamentals show. But I think today's move in the market is pretty indicative of where we stand, as you say. You know, we jumped almost 6%. Now we're just up 1.3%. We could potentially end the day down, despite the U.S. Embarking on this historic strike on Iranian oil, nuclear facilities. Now, I think that's because there has been no change in the flows of oil. Iranian oil facilities and infrastructure weren't hit. The Strait of Hormuz is still flowing. There had been reports that Iran's parliament was to recommend closing the strait, but that's not their decision. That's up for the ultimate leader in Iran to make. But also, can you even close the strait? So the market is really looking at how Iran responds from here and what they're going to do if they're going to strike ships going through the strait that have connections with the U.S., Israel, or Western allies. Are they going to put more mines down in the strait? Or are they going to use their patrol ships to sort of harass the vessels going through? None of that isn't clear yet. And so until there is a response, a larger response from Iran, you're likely going to see this risk premium sort of evaporate.
And yet we have seen two supertankers doing U-turns as they've edged towards the Strait of Hormuz and turning around pretty rapidly. Is this indicative of how our other shippers are thinking about the risks? Where does that oil go? To what extent does even the risk and the threat overhanging the Strait of Hormuz disrupt the global oil trade?
Every company, every ship owner has a different risk profile, and they need to be careful going through there. So there will be some ships that take precautionary steps, right? Just because a ship turns around doesn't mean they're going to abandon their effort to pick up an oil shipment from Saudi Arabia or an LNG cargo from Qatar. Instead, maybe they're going to a safer anchorage to wait. Maybe they are going to avoid it altogether, but these diversions are few and far between. We have to look at them because the market wants to dissect any sort of indication as to what's going to happen with flows. But unlike the Red Sea, which Houthi rebels were essentially able to stop a large portion of oil tankers to go through there in the Suez Canal, this is different. You need to go through the Strait of Hormuz to get to certain ports that ship oil, that ship LNG. There are no other options. So if we do see a lot of ships start to avoid it, that will have a more material impact on the amount of oil on the water, the amount of gas on the water. But just because we've seen a few ships doesn't quite mean it's any reason to panic.
OK, Bloomberg's Stephen Stupczynski, who leads our energy coverage in Asia. Stephen, thank you for the analysis on the oil markets. Let's get more reaction across these markets and bring in Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel standing by for a dive on the impact more broadly. Risk off then across the equity markets, slightly more muted when it comes to the oil price story, as we've been discussing. Val, what stands out to you?
Dollar strength really stood out to me this morning, Tom. The fact that we have S&P futures in the red, but just slightly down less than 0.2%. We are seeing the U.S. dollar, though, up 0.3%. The U.S. dollar has really been outperforming on this risk aversion, and that kind of correlation still takes place today. We are seeing 10-year yields rising off the back of higher oil prices. We've seen that kind of relationship earlier last week, so that's not a surprise either. Gold on the downside, down 0.3%. To me, this is really the market buying this narrative from Trump about a one-and-done attack and this opening up the door for diplomatic relations. I think that's what the market is reading through on this. But let's take a look at how the U.S. dollar has performed since these strikes began on the 13th of June. We're up 1.2%, Tom. This is important because this is the dollar lifting off of three-year lows. Dollar strength has really been the name of the game the last 2 weeks.
Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel, thank you very much indeed. On the focus on the dollar and strength coming through, of course, for that currency on the back of the ratcheting up further of tensions in the Middle East. Coming up, we're going to speak to Jamil Jaffer, former associate counsel to President George W. Bush. We're going to discuss the implications then for the US of Washington's airstrikes on Iran. That is next. This is Bloomberg.
Don't want a regime change. We do not want to protract this or build this out any more than it's already been built out. We want to end their nuclear program, and then we want to talk to the Iranians about a long-term settlement here. We believe very strongly that there are two pathways. There's a pathway where Iran continues to fund terrorism, continues to try to build a nuclear program, attacks American troops. That's the bad pathway for Iran, and it will be met with overwhelming force.
US Vice President J.D. Vance stressing that Washington is not seeking to topple the Iranian government. We're joined now by Jamil Jaffer, founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University. Jamil has served in a number of senior national security roles in the US government, including as an associate counsel to President George W. Bush. Jamil, we appreciate your time this morning. What do you think the end goal is of the Trump administration when it comes to Iran?
Well, it looks like the end goal is clearly to have an Iran that is willing to operate in the world, operate in the region in an appropriate manner, not support terrorism, and not build a nuclear weapon. And so that's the key goal. Whether we're able to achieve that with the current regime in place is a different question, and whether they'll take this opportunity, their nuclear sites haven't been struck, to not strike back, but instead negotiate a middle ground solution is the key question in play today, Tom.
What do you expect the Iranian response will be, given your experience focused on this region?
Look, I can't see a world in which the Iranians don't respond in some way with an offensive strike against the United States. The reality, though, is that while they might hit U.S. forces in the region or try to use cyber capabilities or more likely use a terrorist attack against American interests either in the region or in Europe or in the United States, any one of those is likely to be met with a stiff response by the United States. You saw what Vice President J.D. Vance just said. We've seen President Trump say the same thing. The Secretary of Defense essentially highlighted the exact same thing as well. And so it's going to be very unlikely that if they strike back, the U.S. won't respond in a significant way, particularly if Americans are killed. The Iranians saw what happened when they hit Americans in Jordan with the killing of Qasem Soleimani. They ought to be warned about what could come next.
How realistic do you think it is that military action can resolve the question around Iran's nuclear facilities, given that we have 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium? We don't know the location of that now. It seems at least the US and Israel don't know the location. They have the ability, of course, to build centrifuges, and they've said that they have an enrichment facility somewhere in Iran. Is it realistic to think that military action alone can remove the nuclear threat from Iran?
Well, look, maybe not this military action alone, but certainly over the long run, that can be part of the solution. But you're right. We don't know what we don't know. There may very well be facilities. There almost certainly are facilities in Iran that have nuclear dimensions to them that we have not yet located, not yet struck. That's going to be part of the challenge. To your point, there's all this enriched uranium that's about 60% that might be enriched to weapons grade as well. We need to figure out where that is and extract that. Part of the problem here is that we've allowed Iran to have an enrichment program for so long. You know, we didn't even let our allies, the United Arab Emirates, conduct a nuclear enrichment program. We told them, you want the gold standard, we'll give you enriched uranium if you want to build a civilian program. The idea that back in 2015, the Obama administration would allow an entry into a deal where the Iranians got to keep a nuclear enrichment program is a core part of this problem. It's why President Trump walked away from that JCPOA deal. It's part of why we're here where we are today.
Well, the counter to that would be that the JCPOA, so the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, kept a cap on enrichment, kept a cap on Iran's abilities to build towards a nuclear weapon more effectively than the military action has so far been from Israel and the US.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Tom. That is the core of the debate. The problem, of course, with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is it would have expired in 2025, so we'd be at the expiration of it right now. But even beyond that, it allowed Iran to continue to also develop advanced centrifuge capacity. It also allowed them to continue to build ballistic missiles, which it didn't even have restrictions on. In fact, removed some restrictions on. And perhaps worst of all, it didn't even touch the question of Iran's terrorism around the region. So if you're going to solve the Iran problem, nuclear enrichment is one piece of it. Weaponization is another. Ballistic missiles are a third. And over all of this, Iran's support for Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, these are things that have to be dealt with comprehensively. Unless you demonstrate to Iran you're willing to go up against them directly, as we have now, it's unlikely they're going to put any of that on the table.
Jamil, you've recently suggested that the US should take action to potentially support regime change in Iran. How widely held is that view now within the security apparatus of Washington? To paraphrase President Macron, have we not learned the lessons of Iraq, of Libya?
No, it's a great point, and I think the really important point here is if there's going to be regime change, it can't come from the outside. It can't come with the U.S. coming in and removing the leadership of Iran. It's got to come from the Iranian people. But we know that over half the Iranian population is under the age of 40. We know that 80% of the population does not support their current leadership. They don't like that brutal dictatorship. If they choose to rise up, it's incumbent upon us to support them. We saw the Green Revolution under President Obama. We didn't support them when we had the opportunity. Now's our chance. The Israelis clearly have strong supply lines into Iran to get capabilities in, as we saw on these earlier strikes. So if we can use those supply lines to supply weapons, capabilities, communications gear and the like to the Iranian people, if they want to rise up, we should enable that to happen. We don't need to do it ourselves. We don't need to pick the next leader of Iran. That's for the Iranian people.
Jamil Jaffer, founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University, formerly, of course, a key advisor, and within, of course, the national security apparatus advising George W. Bush. With all that experience, we appreciate your time and insights. Thank you. Coming up, Europe responds to the US strikes on Iran. EU foreign ministers meet in Brussels today with mounting questions about the bloc's ability to influence outcomes in the Middle East. More on that next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. EU foreign ministers meet today in Brussels ahead of a NATO summit in The Hague that President Trump is set to attend. Europe's reaction to America's airstrikes on Iran is likely to be a key focus, of course. Oliver Crook joins me now on the ground in The Hague. So how are European powers responding to the US airstrikes? How much unity is there amongst EU leaders at this point, Ollie?
Yeah. So listen, Tom, over the last week, we've heard a lot from European leaders, and generally speaking, the sort of message has been, and the message over the last 24 hours is de-escalate. Diplomacy has got to be the way forward. This is not going to end through military action. This needs to end basically through diplomacy. You know, we had that sort of message made in very different ways from a number of different leaders across Europe. But overall, until this weekend, you know, there was broadly support for the Israeli strikes for Iran. You are now getting a little bit of sort of reticence, it seems, from some of the statements we're hearing from some of the leaders. Overall, again, the main message has been Iran should never be permitted to get a nuclear weapon. That has been the sort of takeaway here. But we heard from Ursula von der Leyen, who came out after the strikes, saying, I'm just going to pull it up here, that Iran, again, must never be able to acquire a nuclear bomb. With tensions in the Middle East at a new peak, stability must become the priority. And here is a sort of line that is a sort of tacit criticism, potentially, of the United States' action. She said, and respect for international law is critical. This brings into the debate the question about whether this was a preemptive strike or a preventative strike. And the difference between the two is one being a sort of imminent danger that is a preemptive strike that would, allow the United States basically to strike within Iran. The other one is a sort of preventative strike, which is a much more abstract, longer-term sort of concept of what the sort of threat that Iran was proposing. And that is some of the concern that you hear from the international community and certainly domestically from the United States. But overall, Tom, we're here in The Hague. Trump is supposed to arrive here tomorrow to have discussions around NATO, that 5% defense target that NATO allies are likely to sign up to. And the last thing that the Europeans want to do is to alienate Donald Trump at a key moment, not only for Ukraine, but also in the middle of a trade war. And, of course, all those American troops that still reside within Europe as a deterrent force, they don't want Trump to pull them out.
Ollie, fold this into the NATO summit then, and how it changes the discussions, the focus, the priorities, as you and the team and other members of NATO, of course, look ahead to that visit by President Trump.
Yeah, the conversation here is going to be about basically how this bears on Europe, right? I think that one of the main focuses that you have here, there is the idea that, you know, if Iran is extremely weakened, it will also sort of weaken Russia because many of the sort of drones are going over there. But I think more importantly, it's going to distract American attention. America already wanted to move a lot of its resources over to the Pacific. Now, if it is embroiled in the Middle East, that is going to mean more focus there. That means less and less support for Europe. That means Europe going about it alone, which has really been the sort of message from the Trump administration since the very beginning.
Bloomberg's Oliver Crook on the ground for us at The Hague. Thank you. Now, Bloomberg will have interviews with senior European officials at the NATO summit this week, including the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Kaja Kallas, the German Foreign Minister and the Defence Minister of the Netherlands. Coming up, we're going to bring you more reaction to the US attack on Iran. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. The world awaits Iran's response after the US hits nuclear sites in the Islamic Republic. President Trump warns of repercussions for any retaliation. Oil gains on concerns about supply disruption, with a focus on whether Iran will move to block the crucial Strait of Hormuz. US and European futures slide, while the dollar gains amid concerns around escalation in the Middle East. Let's bring you a market check then, with a focus on what is happening with oil prices. You saw an almost 6% pop at the start of trade in terms of Brent pricing. The gains have paired to some extent. Before we get the details on the Iran story, the equities futures picture looking a little risk off, not significantly, but you're pointing lower by 0.5%. Overall, last week you closed lower across European stocks. FTSE 100 futures pointing to losses of 26 points. S&P futures pointing down by 0.2. Nasdaq 100 futures also set to lose around 47 points at this stage. Let's flip the board then and have a look at oil, and then we'll also focus on the reaction around gold, because that is counterintuitive to some extent. Asian session saw losses of 1%, has seen losses so far on the MSCI Asia Pacific. That's the benchmark. Oil then down 1%. You saw losses of more than that, around 5.7% at the start of the session. Those losses, those gains, I should say, have been paired. Oil prices, Brent prices now up just 1%. And we'll see how that adjusts, of course, on any Iranian retaliation. Gold is down 0.4%. The yellow metal not getting a bid, as you see some risk haven moves around, for example, the US dollar. The dollar is up 0.3%, but so far gold is not benefiting from this modest risk-off environment and sentiment filtering across these markets. So that's a check, with the focus continuing, of course, to be on what happens with oil prices and the Iranian retaliation story. Now, the US attacks have, of course, on Iran have been welcomed across the political spectrum in Israel. They've been hailed as an historic symbol of an unprecedented US-Israeli cooperation at a time when the Jewish state has been shunned by some for its war in Gaza. But Israeli leaders have been quick to point out that this does not signal that the US is joining the war against Iran.
We made clear throughout that we are not dragging America into a war, and we are leaving it to the decision of the head of, the President of the United States and his team, because it had to do with America's national security interest, period.
I'm very pleased to say we are joined now by former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. Sir, thank you for taking the time. How would you characterize this moment? Sir, I'm just checking you can hear us. Sometimes connections go down. It's live TV. Just checking, former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, just checking you can hear us. My question was how you would characterize this moment for your region.
Yeah, I think it can become a turning point in the region. I think that I'd say the lifelong desire of Israel was to damage, possibly to destroy, the nuclear program of Iran. And we always knew that it must be done with the United States. It was not just the Israeli interest, it was the interest of every country, certainly the United States of America, that Iran, the Ayatollah regime, will not possess nuclear capacity. And indeed, President Trump decided just a couple of days ago to destroy the sites of the nuclear program in Iran in different places, especially in Fordow, which was a deep down 80, 90 meters underground in the mountain, something that only America could do. And I think that this has brought to the peak the aspirations, the desires, the prayers that we had. So as far as we are concerned, I think that this is the time to end the war in Iran, to end the war in Gaza, and to turn into inside Israel in order to recuperate and to build up again that which was broken in the hearts and minds and spirits of the Israeli people after 2 years of fighting with Hamas and with the Iranians, and with all the pains that were part of it. That's what we need to do now, and this is...
And before we get to that point, we need to get to a point, at least the view of Israel, the view of, it seems, some within the U.S. administration, most, certainly the president, that there needs to be clarity in terms of ending this nuclear program, either via diplomacy or military means. Is there a military solution now, do you think, in terms of ending the nuclear capacities of Iran, given that they have still 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium?
Well, I hope that they don't possess it. I am not certain that anyone knows exactly what happened to these 400 kilos. I hope that they remained in the sites and they were destroyed. But the event that they still have it, I think that Iran needs to assess again what is the cost of these aspirations that they have, and whether this is worthwhile for Iran, for its security, for its stability, to carry on. I think that the signal that was sent on Saturday night to Iran by the United States should force them to reconsider the strategy. Basically, what it says is that, hey, guys, if you continue to try and build, and we will all find out about it, there is nothing that you can hide. You can't hide in order to protect yourselves in the most remote bunkers in Iran, because Israel reached out for every place and eliminated so many of you leaders and you military commanders and so on and so forth. You can't hide anything. So America and Israel and the other forces will find out whether you're trying to rebuild your atomic program, and they will reach out for you. And Iran will become a pariah, will be isolated, will be damaged dramatically. So I think that their interest is to stop it. And I hope that the signal that was given by President Trump Saturday night is of great significance for them.
And so you've been deeply critical, of course, of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the war that he is engaged in Gaza, accusing him and the Israeli government of war crimes in Gaza. Is this decision over the last week to engage Iran and to bring on the U.S., successfully bring on the U.S., is that a political win for the Israeli Prime Minister?
I'm not certain that, first of all, it is a very significant, important and worthy military operation, and definitely something that was entirely in line with the national security interest of the state of Israel, what we don't think about other moves from the Prime Minister. And he deserves to be credited for this decision, the boldness, the courage, the determination, and of course the outstanding performance of the Israeli army, which is really glorious. I mean, when you think about the Israeli Air Force operating 2,000 kilometers from Israel and reaching out for every single point which was of consequence. So, but I think that the overall picture is much different. And we will have to determine sooner than later whether we want Netanyahu to remain in power or not. I hope that he will lose the elections, and I hope the elections will take place soon. Because on the balance, what happened in Israel in the last 2 years was a gigantic failure of judgment, of understanding, of arrogance, of overconfidence. And I think that this has to be taken care of.
To the here and now, how do you think Iran will respond if they do retaliate?
What do you think? If I give them an advice, they will take it.
Do you think the Strait of Hormuz will be closed? How much of a risk do you think is posed to the Strait of Hormuz at this point?
The common wisdom is that Iran has to respond somehow, considering the humiliation and the damage that goes to their status, their position, their influence in the region and beyond the region. They are expected to react. Now, what can they do? They declare war on the United States of America. Shooting at Israel, they did before the American attack. Going back to the April of 2024, when they launched more than 200 ballistic missiles into the state of Israel in the middle of the war in Gaza. So that is part that we have been subject to for a long time. Now, what are they going to do? shoot ballistic missiles at America. I don't think that this is something that even the more extremist, lunatics, fundamentalist, Islamic crazy guys that are running Iran, that this is something that they want to do. So maybe they will close the Strait of Hormuz for a short while. I don't know. I think that there is an opportunity for Iran here to think again about their long-range strategy and possibly, just restrain their natural desire to react in a very extreme manner and try and think about a different direction. I hope maybe that, as I said again before, that the signal that was given, the powerful, decisive signal that was given by President Trump will lead them into a new direction. Let's see.
Okay. Ehud Olmert, former Prime Minister of Israel, thank you so much for your time this morning. Now, Asian airline shares are lower today after US airstrikes on Iran led to a surge in crude oil prices. We know, of course, the higher oil price has paired somewhat in the session today. Bloomberg's Danny Lee joins me now for the impact on the airline sector. Danny, what so far are we seeing in terms of the reverberations across the airline sector from this geopolitical risk?
There are some losses amongst the Asian airlines in the trading session across Asia today. It does speak to some of the concern around this growing conflict we are seeing in the Middle East. There isn't too much exposure for a number of the airlines, but there is a lot of adaptation to what is going on, particularly around flight paths, trying to move away and trying to fly away from some of this part of the troubled region, and also just some impact where there are flights going into the likes of Doha and Dubai, which are some of the big global mega hubs. And so there isn't too much of a widespread disruption yet, but it does speak to some of those broader concerns, because when you look at the likes of the Middle East, how they have grown with aviation, there is a huge part that they play, particularly the benefits for the likes of Emirates and Qatar Airways there. But we haven't seen too much from some of these big dominant carriers reshaping their operations as the risks from this growing conflict unfold. We have seen some adjustments made by Asian and European carriers at least, but that has been limited for the time being. But there is clearly a broader concern out there. But when you look at some of even the European carriers, when you look at how they might trade in the Monday session, they are better protected in terms of hedges. They have hedged more compared to last year already. So we do see that they may have less of an impact when it comes to factoring some of those higher costs through rising oil prices, which oil has actually come down off some of the big highs of the day as well already.
OK, Bloomberg's Danny Lee on the impact on the airline sector, of course, on higher oil prices and disruptions in some parts of the airspace, of course, in the Middle East. As a result of these tensions, Danny, thank you. Coming up, we're going to be joined by Wisdomtree's Aneeka Gupta for her take on market positioning in these times of geopolitical uncertainty. How should you be thinking about adjusting your portfolio? That is next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now, the dollar and oil have paired an early advance as traders wait for Tehran's response after Washington struck Iran's nuclear sites over the weekend. Let's bring in Aneeka Gupta, Director of Macroeconomic Research at Wisdomtree. Aneeka, how much geopolitical risk premium is priced in at this point?
I think there is quite a high premium at present, Tom. Obviously, we've seen the U.S. Strike Iran sooner than expected. We were, previously envisaging a 2-week timeline before President Trump would, lay out his decision. And clearly, the strikes over the weekend have raised that risk off sentiment in the markets because premiums remain high. And we're clearly seeing that reverberate across commodity markets, with energy taking up the baton, precious metals following closely behind, and commodities once again, reaffirming their role as a core hedge amidst rising geopolitical risks.
And what are the different scenarios that you're thinking about when it comes to that oil price story, Aneeka, given that focus right now on the Strait of Hormuz and Tehran's potential retaliation?
Yeah, so the extreme scenario would clearly be, Iran retaliating in a very aggressive way. One of the possible routes would be, closing the critical Strait of Hormuz. And obviously, we know around a fifth of global oil supply is being transported every day. That would, clearly be a very important choke point and result in supply disruptions alongside, as we've seen in prior periods, it could also result in lockstep higher prices, which could also have widespread implications on monetary policy. On the other end of the spectrum, we are seeing very important allies such as Russia and China, who so far have only been giving commitments on the rhetorical side, have not actually, provided clear support to actually stand with Iran against this war that they have against Israel. And I think it's important to see whether it spreads more across beyond the Middle East and not just remain contained within the Middle East. So if that does also take place, then that would really result in a much bigger escalation and have widespread implications across financial markets.
And Aneeka, you touched on the central banks. Your expectation that there are 2 cuts from the Fed, the first of this year in September, then followed by another cut in December. Do you hold that view in light of what we're seeing around the inflation risks?
Well, it could change very quickly, Tom. This is largely predicated on the fact that the labor market is losing that momentum that it held on to in the prior 2 years. And at the same time, inflation is coming closer to the Fed's target rate. But clearly, if we do see, we've got 2 potential risks out there in the market. The first being, those key lockout periods that were placed on those higher tariff rates are coming close to expiry. So July 9th is going to be a really important date on whether Trump actually rolls those lockout periods forward or those they actually expire and those tariff rates actually kick in. That would also have an inflationary impact. In addition, we now have this new layer of uncertainty with, the world awaiting Iran's decision on how they retaliate against the U.S. and Israel. And I think that also adds to another layer of uncertainty, and that's likely to, transpire across markets. It's also likely to transpire in terms of consumer confidence and in lockstep their ability to actually purchase and their consumption patterns. So I think we could see a faster pace of cuts if economic data deteriorates even further than previously anticipated.
On the question of the dollar, we've seen a build-out of positions this year into short dollar. That's a trade that's become in vogue, of course. Does this geopolitical risk revive the fortunes of the greenback?
In a way, yes, we have seen that take place. We've seen those shorts being covered at very fast pace, over the prior week, and obviously the dollar's being bid up. And clearly in lockstep, we've also seen a moderation in gold prices, which had such a strong run for most of 2025. We've seen a bit of paring back of gold's gains as it's become quite expensive. So clearly there is a strong possibility that the dollar could have further, could rally a little bit further as its safe haven role comes back into focus as this geopolitical uncertainty rises as we wait Iran's decision. That being said, it's important to keep in mind over the long term, gold's safe haven role, still has a notable role to play. I think what's been really interesting is we did get the survey from central bank buying of gold, and it's actually risen to the highest level on record. And the expectation is that central banks, continue to maintain that floor for gold prices as they, their intentions for the year ahead are to continue to buy gold as an important reserve asset.
Well, just on the here and now in terms of the pricing around gold, with gold down 0.4%, Aneeka, what do you think explains the pressure on gold in a heightened geopolitical environment in terms of uncertainty?
Well, there's a lot. There's a lot at play, Tom. We've seen within the precious metals market, silver and silver and platinum, which are more industrialized precious metals, taking some of that, benefiting on the coattails of gold's strong performance. The platinum market, for example, has been in a deficit for over, the prior 3 years. However, it was gold that had been the, predominant front runner when it came to investors trying to hedge some of that geopolitical uncertainty. What we've seen over the past month is China's been really ramping up their imports of platinum. That's also, led to an increase in price. And in lockstep, we've seen, a bit of a rotation take place within precious metals.
OK, Aneeka Gupta, Director of Macroeconomic Research at Wisdomtree, on the market reaction to what is evolving in the Middle East and thoughts on how to position going forward. The focus, of course, on central bank reaction as well, with those inflation story being adjusted on the back of potentially high oil prices. We continue to keep an eye, of course, on Iran's response. There's plenty more coming up. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
There could be secondary and tertiary impact. Let's say there is more turbulence that goes into hitting growth prospects of large economies, and then you have a trigger impact in a downward revision of prospects for global growth.
IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva speaking to Bloomberg there about the potential economic impact of US strikes on Iran. And it does seem that the ball is now in Iran's court in terms of how they respond, how they retaliate, if indeed that is where they go. And the focus, of course, is on the Strait of Hormuz and to what extent they may move to at least partially block that, possibly for a day, possibly for a number of days. All these different scenarios are being played out across the markets right now. The pricing around Brent, though, you saw that 5.7% pop at the start of the session. You've now seen that moderate pretty significantly. You're seeing pricing around $78 a barrel. That compares historically, of course, to the numbers that we had on the screen. We just flipped on from that. But compared to what you saw during the peak of that Russian invasion of Ukraine, where you saw oil prices around $130 a barrel, we are, of course, a long way from that. OPEC Plus is playing that role as well in terms of putting more oil on the market. In terms of the inflation impact, we were just speaking to Wisdomtree, their view that you still get 2 cuts from the Fed this year. But, of course, that eye on the inflation input around higher oil prices, you get to that $130 a barrel that some economists have suggested is possible. If you get a closure of the Strait of Hormuz, you could be looking at 3.9% in terms of the print on CPI from that inflation impact of higher oil prices. Those are some of the scenarios that markets are looking at. In terms of the odds of the closure at Strait of Hormuz, those are still being worked out by the markets. The opening trade is up next. This is Bloomberg.